panelist is Helen Young, an esteemed colleague, former colleague, when I could call myself a faculty member at Middlebury, and teacher at Middlebury College, and also a resident of Bristol, Vermont, where I live. And among other things, Helen's very interested in pollinators. She's done a lot of work on the pollination of jewelweed, but other pollinators as well. So she's giving us. She is capable of giving us. We'll see what she does give us, but she's capable of giving us a scientific background on the biology of pollination and on some of the ecological issues.
All right. Can you hear us out there in the Netherlands, south and so you're all south of us? Yeah. All right. I want to state some obvious things first because no one else has. About 75% of all flowering plants rely on pollinators to help them with sexual reproduction. Plants can't move, but they need gametes, male gametes from another plant to help them successfully propagate sexually, and pollinators are doing that for them. So I say 3/4, that means about 25% are wind pollinated, and those tend to be the crops that we rely on heavily. Corn, wheat, oats, all the grains are all wind pollinated. And they'll be fine when bees disappear from the face of the earth. But the remainder of the 3/4 of the plants and the majority of fruit crops will not. And so we're reliant on these animals. I haven't specifically talked about bees yet, but we're reliant on animals for the majority of the fruits and vegetables that we eat. And in fact, for the majority of the meat that you're eating, if those cows, chickens, etc., were fed on clover or alfalfa, those are insect pollinated crops. So we're talking a lot about pollination because it's critical for human survival. And yet I'm a biologist who tries to distance herself from human-based necessities. The majority of plants, whether we use them for crops or not, are pollinated by animals. And the ones that I'm most interested in are the ones that are pollinated by bees. So we need bees. If you like strawberries and raspberries and blueberries and watermelon and zucchini and hundreds of other crops, indirectly you are dependent upon these bee pollinators and the health of those colonies. So Kirk and Bill emphasized honeybees, which is the genus Apis, for those of you who like Latin names, which in North America are not native. They were imported with the early colonists as a source of sugar. They were providing honey for early colonists. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I come at questions with a much longer lens than the last 300 or 400 years. So I started, when I moved to Vermont 15 years ago, I started studying bumblebees because they are native here. And I was interested in how native species interact with each other. So my first decade here was studying a native plant and its native bumblebee pollinator. It turns out that bumblebees are really, really important, so that although we need honeybees, we have exploited honeybees to the extent that we have become very reliant on them as a domesticated, movable species. One of my research directions came from colony collapse disorder, when honeybee decline seemed to be happening frighteningly quickly. I was interested in whether bumblebees could fill in this gap that the colony collapse disorder was causing. And so let me tell you a couple things about bumblebees that makes their biology really different and the way they interact with plants very differently. And then I'll talk about climate change, since that's where we were supposed to aim this. So bumblebees are larger and hairier than honeybees. They carry more pollen because their bodies are hairier. Because they're larger and hairier, they forage at a lower temperature. So they can forage earlier in the spring, later in the fall, earlier in the morning. They exist in very small colonies in comparison to honeybees. So what's the average size of your colony of a honeybee? 10,000, 5,000 bees in a hive?
Well, it goes from, 5 or 10,000 at the end of the winter up to even 70 or 80,000.
Perfect. And honeybee colonies will be about bumblebee, a large one may have about 100 bees in it. So you need a lot of colonies. You can't equate the sizes of the two. So bumblebee colonies are very small. The only bee that survives the winter is a single queen for each colony. So this is just so cool, and I don't know if you were going to do this, but I'm going to do it. To describe the life cycle of a bumblebee. Late fall, the colonies start producing drones. Funny. That had a different meaning 5 years ago, which are male bees. And they're produced solely because they produce sperm. So they produce male bees that once they leave the colony, they're not allowed back. They don't bring food back for any developing workers. They are out to disseminate their sperm. At the same time, queens are being produced, and they are flying around looking for these drones, and mating takes place. Everybody dies but the mated queen, who finds a place to overwinter, which at least in Vermont tends to be a north-facing rocky slope, which is fascinating. She wants it to be north-facing so that on warm days in the spring, when you have that rare day that's really warm, it would be a mistake for her to think, I'm free, I'm going to leave now, because the next day is likely to be very cold. So a north-facing slope warms up very slowly. By the time it's warm, the environment around her is warm. So there she is, inseminated, starving. She hasn't eaten since fall. She's heavily reliant on something flowering to feed her. So the timing of bumblebee emergence, queen emergence in the spring, is very tightly associated with the timing of early flowering spring ephemerals. An early emerging bee will starve. So one of the consequences of climate change with increased temperature and variability in moisture, it's already been demonstrated to promote earlier flowering of plants. So there's been beautiful work showing that flowering time is earlier now than it was 20, 50 years ago. If the bees are not emerging at the time to take advantage of those flowers, or if the bees are emerging even earlier, if they're responding to different cues in the environment than the plants are, I think you can see that the mismatch, they call this a phenological mismatch, can be disastrous. The plants don't get pollinated because the bees aren't out yet, so sexual reproduction doesn't occur, or if the bees emerge first, they starve because there's nothing to eat. So hopefully, if all goes well, she eats, she consumes a lot of nectar and pollen, she moves to a nest where she's going to lay all of her eggs. And this is a very different location, very different nest than her winter nest. And in Vermont, they tend to be ground nesting. They like abandoned rodent holes, tufts of grass. She'll go in there and build a little pot for the nectar she's bringing back and start to lay eggs. And so in the spring, I don't know if you noticed, in early spring, the only bumblebees you see are big. These are queens, which are twice the size of workers. So she's foraging, laying eggs, and until those eggs hatch and mature into workers, she's the only one feeding them. So she has to work really hard. Once the workers are produced and they can go out and forage, she stays home and puts her feet up and does nothing but lay eggs, and everyone feeds her. But that first month is really critical. So she's got these two different nesting sites. So clearly you need environmental heterogeneity. You need some stability in knowing that those nesting sites will be available. Then the workers forage wonderfully, and they are pollinating many of the plants, both crops and wild plants. And then we go back to workers being produced, drones, and that's where we started. So their colonies are much smaller. One of the consequences of having only a queen overwinter is the genetic variation of a population is defined by the very small number of queens that do overwinter. So there are what we call genetic bottlenecks that happen every winter with the queens that survive and make it to the following spring. So genetically, they're probably quite different than honeybees, which are managed in a way that increases overwintering. Humans are managing genetic variation. We're comparing a wild species with a domesticated species. And then, because I know I've probably I could go on for hours, but I'm gonna, bumblebees can do a unique thing that honeybees can't, which is called buzz pollination. And flowers that need buzz pollination are really important to us. They're cranberries, blueberries, and everything in the tomato family. Eggplants, tomatoes, peppers. We should be able to name more. These are all plants whose anthers, which are the sacs where the pollen is stored, require a vibration to get the pollen out. So next time you're out among a garden with any of those plants in them, go and watch bumblebees, because you'll hear them buzzing as they approach the flower, and then they'll grab onto the anthers and they'll buzz at a different frequency. It's almost always a higher frequency. So you hear the buzz as they approach, and then buzz, buzz, and they're shaking the pollen onto their stomachs. And as they visit another flower, they're dispersing the pollen. Honeybees can't do that. So it turns out that honeybees are okay pollinators of blueberries, cranberries, tomatoes, etc. Bumblebees are superior. They're really wonderful pollinators of these. And so the presence of these wild bees that very few people have figured out how to manage or domesticate does increase crop yield for any of those plants, and for a whole bunch of plants whose flowers don't need buzz pollination. So some beautiful work in California showed that the presence of wild bees increased watermelon yield statistically significantly over farms that only had honeybees present at them. So the presence of different kinds of bees is probably augmenting yield in ways that we can predict if you know a lot about the details of species interactions. So climate change. I mean, I mentioned one thing that is a major concern is this phenological mismatch, and we don't always know which direction it's going to go. I guess the literature I know best are botanical literature that shows that plants are flowering earlier, and whether the bees are emerging even earlier than that or too late to take advantage. I don't know the answer to that yet. If the climate dries in any way, like California currently is, let me step back one step to say bees, honeybees and bumblebees are totally reliant on flowers for their food. They're not going to McDonald's. There's no secret source of nutrition for them. They need nectar from flowers and pollen from flowers, and that's the only place they can get it. So flowering plants are really essential. In a drought, nectar production declines. Plants can't afford to make very much nectar, so that might lead to a ever hungrier bee population. Once nectar volume declines, the concentration increases. And it's hard for bees to suck up nectar that's really concentrated. It'd be like you trying to drink a milkshake from a very skinny straw. They just can't do it. And if given their preferences, they will visit something else. So less nectar, it's concentrated, it makes it very difficult for bees to get it. It turns out also that in drought, plants decrease their pollen production. So I think you can see that if water's limiting, all these things that bees need from plants is limiting and is likely to lead to population declines of those pollinators. And then you get into this nasty cycle, and then the reproductive biology of the plants declines, and it may not be easily recoverable, even if a wet season follows. So that's sort of an introduction to some of the things that population biologists are thinking about in terms of climate change and how that'll affect pollination.